All right, everybody. So now we're going to start on chapter 13, which is an introduction to viruses. I know it's a little strange to jump so far ahead, but I just think it makes more sense to basically introduce the viruses at the same time that we're introducing bacteria, and go over all of the basic information about this group in a very similar way that we did with chapter 4 and bacteria. So I didn't write the book. If I would have written the book, I would have probably put this chapter, for chapter 5. All right. So here we go. The first thing that kind of tells you almost everything about viruses is the word virus means poison. The first virus was isolated in lab in 1935 by Wendell Stanley. And viruses are essentially cellular hijackers. So the technical term is obligatory intracellular parasites. Basically, what viruses do is they get inside of cells. They do various different things inside of those cells, but normally it's they just take it over. They basically come in and say, hey, I'm the virus, I'm taking over now. And then once they have forced the cell to do whatever they're trying to get the cell to do, they usually kill the cell or cause it to explode, and obviously the cell's dead. So they are, they're bad. When we talked about bacteria before, and we'll continue to mention about bacteria, the vast majority of bacteria on Earth are totally harmless. They are just living their life. They're not doing anything to hurt anybody or do much of anything except live their life. With viruses, viruses are hurting something. It might not be a human being, but viruses always need some sort of host. So they're almost always, a killer of cells, depending on what type of cells or what type of species, but they're still hurting some form of living thing. So speaking of living thing, it's actually up for debate whether viruses are actually living things. There's lots of people out there, myself included, who don't really consider viruses to be a living thing because living things are supposed to be made up of cells, and viruses are not made up of cells. So therefore, not technically a living thing. But of course, there's people who say they are living things because they still, they still do something, or they're made up of DNA or whatever reason. So I think I probably mentioned this at some point in chapter 1, but just in case, okay, there will be a question on the test that asks you whether or not viruses are a living thing. As long as you answer the question, you will get it correct. You'll get a point for answering the question. Whether you say yes, no, maybe, sometimes, it depends, or I'm not sure, I'm still deciding. Whatever answer you want to put, just put an answer, okay? And you will get a point for that question. So it's basically kind of like a free point on the test, but it also makes you remember that this is something that still really is kind of up for debate and probably will be forever. You develop your own opinion about whether you think viruses are, if they should be considered a living thing or not. So viruses can contain DNA or RNA. That's actually one of the main ways that we classify viruses. We classify them as either a DNA virus or an RNA virus. And then the material, whether it's DNA or RNA, is then surrounded by a protein coat which is called a capsid. So don't get capsid confused with capsule, okay? So bacteria, some bacteria have capsules, right? All viruses have a capsid. A capsid is basically their version of a cell membrane, okay? But it's not a cell membrane, it is a protein coat. So like I said, viruses have to get inside of a cell and then they take it over, meaning they basically kind of take over the nucleus, they take over the endoplasmic reticulum, they take over the mitochondria, they basically take over. They're like, I'm in charge now, and now the cell has to do what the virus says. So viruses will actually, they'll use the cellular machinery to synthesize various different structures, various different products. You know, there's all kinds of different things that viruses can do once they're inside of the cell. The other thing they do is they take over the cell's ability to create enzymes. So let's say, you know, let's say for the heck of it that the, you know, the cell is supposed to be making lactase. That's an easy enzyme to talk about. So the cell is supposed to be making lactase, and then the virus comes in, and the virus says, nope, you're not making that enzyme anymore. You're going to make the enzyme that I tell you to make. And that's another thing that viruses do to cells. So another way that we kind of classify viruses is based off of their host range. The host range of a virus is the type of cells that they infect. So there's some viruses that just go after bacteria. There's some viruses that just go after plants. There's some viruses that will only come after humans, right? But then there's viruses that they can come after like with rabies. Like rabies can affect humans, it can affect dogs, cats, skunks, raccoons. Like, so, you know, there's some viruses that will have multiple different, you know, organisms as their host. So some viruses have a very, very specific host range, and some viruses are kind of, you know, a little bit wider range or have a larger spectrum of cells that it can actually infect. It just depends on the virus. So some viruses have an envelope, and they're called enveloped viruses. It is a coating of various different types of chemicals that surround the capsid. So basically, you know, again, if you think about the example of a bacterial cell, you have, you know, all bacterial cells, they have the plasma membrane, they have the cell wall, and then some of them have a capsule. With viruses, they all have a capsid, and then some of them have an envelope. So some viruses are enveloped and some of them are not, okay? So just like how the capsule can give bacteria, you know, special abilities or different types of functions, it's the same kind of idea. The envelope can give the virus, you know, allow it to attach better to a host, allow it to have certain spikes, you know, whatever. And then viruses that don't have an envelope around them are called non-enveloped viruses, and oftentimes they have a stronger capsid in order to make up for that. So this picture, this is a fantastic picture. It's on page 360, and I'm sure I've mentioned by now that I do have, I believe I have the older edition of the book, so the page number might be slightly different for some of you. And the picture looks a little bit different than how I'm presenting it in the PowerPoint, but you guys will be able to find it. It's pretty similar. But this is a really neat picture because it shows you this huge diversity in the sizes and the shapes of viruses. So everything that's kind of like in the bluish color is a virus, okay? So if you look over here, this is kind of like the edge of a human red blood cell, okay? So a tiny red blood cell is still microscopic, and yet it is, it would be huge in comparison to these viruses. Then we have a single cell of E. coli. So this gives you an example of E. coli compared to some viruses. And then we have right here, this is another bacteria. This is chlamydia. So you can see, like this bacteria, E. coli, is really tiny when you compare it to a human red blood cell, but then it's large when you compare it to chlamydia. And now you can see all these different viruses. The one that probably jumps out at you the most is the Ebola virus. It is, pretty kind of creepy, scary looking, and it's a very large virus, as you can see here. This is one case where a virus is actually bigger than a bacteria. It is possible. You can have a very tiny bacteria and a very large virus, and they end up in kind of that kind of format. Then up here you have the rabies virus. One of the really kind of weird, fascinating things about the rabies virus is that it's bullet shaped. It literally looks like a little tiny bullet under the electron microscope. Then you have the Vaccinia virus here. So this is the chickenpox virus. So you can see it's, kind of like in the middle, not too big, not too small. The polio virus is very tiny, okay? Adenoviruses, which usually cause like a cold type thing, but not the common cold. The common cold is over here, the rhinovirus. So usually rhinoviruses cause the common cold in humans. Adenoviruses will usually cause something similar, but in like dogs and cats. And then bacteriophages, we're going to talk about those in a little bit here. These are viruses that infect bacteria. So you can see here's like a real teeny tiny one, and here's one that kind of has almost like a rod shape to it. And then the T4 bacteriophage really, really looks crazy. We're going to look at a bigger picture of that later on. The tobacco mosaic virus, which is a virus that goes after the tobacco plant as well as tomato plants. A viroid is a type of virus that usually goes after plants as well. And then finally a prion, which a prion actually isn't even a virus, it's an infectious protein. And you can see that, it can actually be, larger than some of these extra tiny viruses. So huge diversity in the size and shape of viruses. It's really a fascinating thing to kind of look at and to study and be like, wow, how can these things look so different and be so different from, all the different types of cells that we know about. They're just so weird and so different. Now, obviously, I'm not going to have you identify any of these by, picture on the test or anything. And certainly, I'm not going to ask you any of the measurements, nothing like that. It's just to give you an idea about this huge diversity in what viruses look like and their different sizes and shapes. Obviously, you're going to need to know things like what a bacteriophage is, what a viroid is, the rhinovirus, that kind of stuff. But we'll talk about that stuff later. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here. I only have about 1 minute left. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then we'll pick up with the next PowerPoint slide.